Hello, and welcome to Central Booking, where writers and readers are the authority. I'm your host, John Valeri. Today on Central Booking, award-winning author and former LAPD recruit Aaron Philip Clarke reveals how fact informs his fiction. Aaron's latest, Under Color of Law, is the first book to feature LAPD detective Trevor Finnegan, better known as Finn. The title was just named a finalist for the International Thriller Writers' Best Paperback Original Novel Award. In Under Color of Law, Finn is tasked with solving the high-profile murder of an LAPD recruit, only to find the secrets of his own past resurfacing, which threaten both his personal and professional livelihood. With his reputation on the line, Finn must confront issues of culture, politics, race, and even romance if justice is to be done. A native of Los Angeles, Aaron is also a screenwriter and college professor. He holds a BFA in writing for film and television and an MFA in writing. His previous novels include The Science of Paul, A Healthy Fear of Man, and The Furious Way. Under Color of Law is the winner of the 2021 Book Pipeline Adaptation Contest. Best-selling author Jason Pinter called it an absolutely riveting book that belongs in the pantheon of LA crime novels alongside Connolly's The Black Echo, Mosley's Devil in a Blue Dress, and Elroy's The Black Dahlia. Under Color of Law is a landmine placed at the intersection of law enforcement, race, media, and politics by an author who clearly knows the volatile territory. Now, Aaron Philip Clarke takes us behind the blue line to share how the realities of law enforcement color his powerful, provocative fiction. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Central Booking. Today, I am in the virtual company of critically acclaimed author Aaron Philip Clarke, whose new book, Under Color of Law, is out right now, and it was the 2021 Book Pipeline Adaptation winner. That's a bit of a mouthful, but welcome to the show, and congratulations to you on that great honor.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Well, I'm happy to be talking to you. I have to say, one of the greatest joys of being a reader is when someone sends a book your way and it just kind of wows you and knocks you out, and you thought you had all these plans and then everything just comes to a stop until the book is done. That is totally the experience that I had with your book. And I don't know how I have not read you before now, but that will not happen again. I will rectify the error of my ways.
Oh, well, thank you. That's a major compliment. If I was able to keep you from your plan, then that's a high bar.
There you go. It's like, well, mom's going to sleep a little bit longer. The dishes are staying in the sink. The laundry might have to wait until tomorrow. So there. Now people have been forewarned. It is one of those books that you turn a page and then you turn all of the pages. But I thought I would start by asking you to pretend that you are stepping into my virtual elevator, and anybody who's watching, they're going to come with us, and you're going to take this brief moment in time to sort of give us the elevator pitch for this book. And if you wouldn't mind also telling us about the significance of the title, because I found that this is a very multi-textured title and it fits, on a lot of levels thematically, if you wouldn't mind starting there.
Sure. So it's set in 2014 in the wake of Eric Gardner is murdered by the NYPD, and it centers on Trevor Finnegan, who's a rookie detective in the robbery homicide of LAPD, and he's tasked with having to investigate the homicide of a young Black recruit named Brandon Soledad. And in the course of the investigation, secrets are revealed. He confronts elements of his own identity, his identity as a police officer, but also his identity as a man, and specifically African-American man, living in the wake of these police killings. And essentially, as the story progresses, we learn that Brandon Soledad's murder potentially connects to Trevor Finnegan's past. Sure.
I knew you were going to do really well with that because I read that you're also a screenwriter, so I figured you're probably pretty good at pitching, but that was pretty solid. And can you tell me a bit about how the title came about, and if that was your title or if it was suggested to you, because it does sort of encapsulate the book so beautifully.
Sure. So Under Color of Law, it's taken from a legal statute. So essentially what it means is that if a sworn officer, anyone who is sworn under oath as a law enforcement officer, so you don't have to be a cop, you actually could be any kind of law enforcement capacity. But if you commit a crime while wearing the badge, so to speak, then there's some additional enhancements in terms of prosecution and prison time and things that can, consequences that can happen. And so obviously, without giving a whole lot away, in terms of the book, but there are individuals in the book who do commit crimes under color of law. And originally, I had actually dropped the under, I just called it color of law. And I think the feeling was that it was a little bit on the nose. And a lot of people didn't realize that it was referencing the actual criminal statute. So, we went back and just kept it pure, so to speak, and said, hey, this is it. So in the book, I mean, it opens up with Department of Justice definition of it so that people, have a good understanding.
Sure. Yeah, I figured that was a very poetic and beautiful starting point. I like that we actually can read the statute because, there is more in there than you might think. So that was kind of a fascinating beginning point. So I wanted to ask you, so at one point in time, you yourself were a police academy recruit with the LAPD. So I'm wondering if you can tell us how you were able to draw on both the emotional and physical realities of that experience to help in developing Trevor Finnegan's character.
Sure. So I was actually in the academy in 2014, and during that time, it was an interesting place to be because it was politically charged. Though we weren't supposed to talk politics, or as they called it, politics, in the academy, anything that didn't have to do with training was kind of frowned upon. And so I wanted to kind of capture that environment in this novel because I felt like it was so interesting because it's a place of training and a place where you should learn. And there were so many taboo topics that we weren't allowed to bring up without suffering the consequence of having to do push-ups, or as we call it, discipline, or DP, which meant, drop down and give me 20 for your question, right? And it happened to me multiple times because I had a lot of questions. So prior to me going in, I was a college professor. So education has always been a huge part of my life. And I've just been inquisitive. I was, since day one. So I had a lot of questions about police procedure and as it related to things that actually happened. And so I asked them, and, I remember my sergeant was like, that has nothing to do with what we're doing. And it had everything to do with what we were doing, but he felt it had nothing to do with what we were doing at the time. But we were talking about use of force. And so I said, in this situation, and I was actually bringing up an incident that had occurred on a college campus where a professor had been detained for jaywalking and it turned physical. And so, I ended up getting disciplined, and I think I had to do like 20 push-ups, for my question. And so that was the environment that I was going through in the academy. And I really wanted to capture that in this book, where it was just kind of under the surface, this idea that, we're just here to get trained. We're just here to do our jobs, and we can't care about all the other, because all that somehow gets under the umbrella of politics. But really, that was the place to discuss those issues. And I think there was a lot of missed opportunities there.
Right. And I would assume, it's one of those experiences that you can read about, you can see stuff about it on TV, but you really have to be there in that room experiencing it for yourself to really have an appreciation and understanding for what the realities are like. But it's a really interesting perspective that you bring to this book. I did want to ask you a bit about policing because obviously, being a police officer is a very complicated thing, perhaps now more than ever. In this book, as you mentioned, it takes place mostly in 2014, a bit in 2010, but policing is a complicated thing. And I think particularly for somebody of color, which you are able to bring into this book. So can you talk a bit about, the special considerations that an officer who is Black has that an officer who is white would not have?
Sure. I mean, from my experience, there's this element of duality that has to exist. And, for a lot of officers of color, and specifically, Black officers, when you work within your own community, you're going to encounter people who look at you as kind of being this turncoat, right? And look at you as being part of the problem. Even if you're like Trevor Finnegan and you're there because you actually want to help, people don't always see that. What they're going to see is the authority first. So they're going to see the badge, they're going to see the gun, they're going to see the uniform. And that immediately can turn people off. And as the community has changed and these things have come to light, and the idea of community policing, I guess as policing has changed, the community has been a little bit more open in some instances to wanting to work with the police. And it obviously varies community by community, but for the most part, at least here in Los Angeles, there has been somewhat a shift. But when these incidents happen, these incidents of police brutality, deaths of unarmed Black men or people of color, then it's like you take 10 steps back. And so it's this never-ending cycle. And there's really, it's interesting because I remember, I try not to read a whole lot of reviews, but there was one review where someone said, I wish at the end of the book there was this answer, right? I wish at the end he told us what to do. And I said, well, as a writer, that's not my job, but at the same time, I understood the frustration because there is no clear answer. I think a lot of it begins with training. And I think that it starts in the academy, kind of weeding out those officers who are going to make those kind of errors when they're out there dealing with the public. But all those little errors add up, and it really can stain the relationship between police and the community.
No, it's very true. And, I grew up sort of during the age of the O.J. Simpson trial, and before that, Rodney King and the aftermath. And it's just so different now because you can hear about these things that were happening and not necessarily see them. Now with, dash cams and cell phone footage, you really do have a better, I think, appreciation for the gravity of the situation because you see it for yourself. And when you actually see it, that's a much different thing than, hearing about it and thinking it's a very isolated incident, when really it's unfortunately happening, all around us sort of all the time. So I certainly appreciate your perspective on that. And I wanted to ask you too, Finn has a really interesting dynamic with his father. I believe his name is Sean. And so Finn's father was a police officer as well. He's now retired, and in his retirement, he's become a bit more outspoken about violence, systematic violence, racism, corruption. And my understanding is that character is actually based on your uncle and also some people that who were former police officers who had to sort of exist within a code of silence and really could only speak up when they were no longer on active duty. So I'm just wondering if you can talk a bit about that code of silence and what you learned from these people who finally felt liberated to speak about it after they were no longer active police members.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily say Sean is a one for one, if you will, kind of based on my uncle, but there's elements there. Once my uncle retired from LAPD, it was interesting because I saw a change in him. And so it was almost as if now he had the opportunity to look back. And I remember he went to one of the policemen galas, and it was his class. It was everyone from his kind of like a reunion. It was everyone from his academy class. And he told me he got up at the podium and he told, the story. And the story was that he had started off in Southwest Division, which was a very tough division, gang neighborhood. You didn't learn a whole lot, but you did learn how to be aggressive because that was kind of the culture at that particular division, because they were dealing with a lot of violence. And so he essentially said that he learned that kind of the hard charge kind of police work. And then when he went to another division and he got a new partner, his partner said, hey man, we actually don't need to do that. Like, that's not how we need to conduct ourselves. And that actually has a negative impact because word will get around that you're one of those kind of cops, and they're not going to want to work with you. You may need somebody in this community to help you solve a murder or help you, essentially solve a crime, no matter what it is. And they have to be able to work with you and trust you. And so he said it was kind of like a moment where he realized, like, yeah, and this is before the push for community policing, but for him, that was that kind of aha moment of like, yeah, I don't have to do this. I can do my job without feeling like, I'm going to war every day. And so for him, that was kind of a change. And so, I remember he said, yeah. And I said, you told that story? And he said, yeah, I told that story. Because he said, everyone knows it's true. He said, these are the things that police talk about behind the scenes. He said, they don't want, the media and all that, they don't want you to know that we have these kind of conversations. But he said, we have these kind of conversations all the time. And this is like around the time where the whole kind of Blue Lives Matter and things like that was starting to take root. But the one thing that he kind of imparted was, if you're ever gonna, and at the time I had no interest in writing a cop story, but he said, if you ever write one, make sure that you tell the truth and that you actually, show us as human beings, because he said that's the one thing that, and he wasn't a big TV watcher and big into films, but when he did watch them, he said, that's just not right. He's like, we're not like that. He's like, it was so sensational. And for him, it's just human beings, trying to do their job and do the best they can. And so when I went into writing Under Color of Law, that's really what was in the back of my head, was craft the characters as human beings.
Sure. And I think then you really, feel for him in the dilemmas that he goes through. And I did want to ask you, and I think you mentioned this, a bit earlier in our conversation, but Finn really does sort of struggle with his sense of identity, and he tends to view himself as a better cop than as a man. So I'm wondering if you can tell us, what does he see as his shortcomings, and how do the events of this book, in sort of non-spoilery fashion, how do those sort of force a self-reckoning or reevaluation on him?
Sure. So, Finn has a lot of guilt, and I think he shares that with Sean. He shares that with his father. But it's this idea that Finn failed to be, as he would look at it, a good man early in his life. That he essentially blames himself for allowing his best friend to be sexually assaulted, because he blames himself for that because he physically was not there, that he left, and she was put in this situation where he wasn't able to intervene. And so that kind of is what propels him to go into law enforcement. It haunts him. It's something that he can't shake. And in his mind, he thinks, if I can go into law enforcement, maybe I can stop this from happening. And so once he's in the police department, that's when he started thinking, oh, well, I'm pretty smart. I can make a go of this. Or maybe I could be chief one day. And so, and it's interesting because it's something that I think happens. I saw it with my classmates, but it's something that happens once you're in, where you start looking at all the possibilities. And, some of my classmates were like, look, I'm just going to be a street cop. That's it. But, you can see the workings of other folks, how their minds were working. And they were seeing themselves as, detective 1, 2, 3, move on to sergeant. They saw themselves matriculating even perhaps all the way up to chief. If you were savvy and you had a good head on your shoulders and you were good with communicating, you could write your own ticket in there. And so I think that, that's kind of that's the approach that Finn ends up taking. It's almost like he starts believing his own hype, as he kind of excels to the academy, and then he goes on and he's this rookie detective and kind of this hotshot detective. But he starts kind of believing, that he can, to an extent, do what he wants to do, and that he can kind of write his own ticket. Because despite this thing existing in his backstory, he thinks that, okay, I can overcome that as long as I'm a good cop. But when that badge comes off and he's forced to have to reckon with who he is as a man, well, that's a different story.
Sure. And I'm going to ask you a bit more about that story because, obviously his professional life is very complicated and there's many, many layers to that. So there's all this on the job intrigue, but then he has a complicated love life as well. So I'm wondering if you can tell us about the women that he's been keeping company with, and also how the possibility of a romance, with his childhood friend that you mentioned, I believe her name is Sarada. How does that heighten the overall stakes for him?
Well, it's in terms of his relationship with Sarada, it's the idea of hope, right? He looks at it as like maybe one day, we'll get together and we can kind of move past the trauma, the shared trauma that we experience. And she is like a confidant. She's probably the only character that he can't really hustle or kind of lie to or kind of shine on when they ask kind of probing questions. He has to kind of, you have to be honest with her. And for the most part, he is. And so there's that relationship, but then he also has Tori Krause, who is a sometimes girlfriend. And she obviously wants more, but he, at his stage, he can't commit to anything serious. But it harkens back to him not necessarily feeling like he's a good man, because he does string her along and there's consequences to it, but he does string her along and kind of, in some ways, as he's hopeful that he can get with Sarada, well, Tori's hopeful that one day he'll snap out of it and be like, okay, let's actually have a relationship. So it's all these expectations that the characters have for each other that never really come into fruition.
Sure. And I love that, there's that added element of suspense, in addition to who done it, how done it, why done it, there's also that element of will they or won't they get together, which is great. I love all that, sort of multi-textured nuance. But I did want to ask you about setting too, because Under Color of Law, takes place in Los Angeles, which is vast. It's varied. There is so much to LA. It's not just Hollywood. It's not just Tinseltown. And, many people have used it as a backdrop. But the fun thing, I think, is that, Walter Mosley's LA is different than Michael Connelly's, is different than Marcia Clark's, is different than yours. So I'm wondering if you can tell us, how you see this setting enhancing this particular story and what it is that you hope to impart on readers about the city at large.
Yeah, so I read quite a few novels, beginning with like Joseph Wambaugh, and that are set in LA, that center on LAPD, or at least a detective working in Los Angeles. And so I wanted to have, obviously, LA as a character, but at the same time, I wanted to show a different side. Maybe, Finn goes to Skid Row. He goes to places that I have seen a little bit in crime fiction, but not a whole lot. And so it's such a big part of the novel, the kind of the texture and the tapestry of the city, but it's not supposed to be glitz and glamour by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, Finn talks about this idea that there are two Los Angeleses. It's the idea that, yeah, it's this facade that people come out here, get off buses to become actors, models, and everything in between. And they have all these high hopes because they think it's truly Tinseltown. But he's in the underbelly. He doesn't even get to interact with any of that because he's having to deal with people who are incredibly desperate or who are at the rock bottom and at very difficult places in their lives. And that's what he sees every day. And so I wanted to kind of showcase that within the novel, that in some ways it parallels how Trevor sees himself, how Finn sees himself. That sure, LA has the potential to be a wonderful city, but they can't even fix the homelessness situation. So, it's one of those where it's incredible wealth and possibility, but then on the other side of that spectrum, it's squalor, it's pain, it's desperation, and it's a blight in many ways for the city, because it's embarrassing. It's embarrassing to be one of the wealthiest cities in the United States, and you can't get people off the street. And so, I wanted Finn to have that experience, to go through and in some ways, reflect on that. And that at the same time though, he loves the city. You know, he finds beauty in everything, or he tries to, and maybe that's the artist side of him, but he tries to find beauty in everything. But you know, at times it's hard. It's really hard to love LA sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a dichotomy. I have not spent a lot of time there. I was in LA twice, really, really briefly, but it's amazing because, you can literally find yourself a block away from where you just were, and it's a complete world of difference. It's amazing. Like until you experience it, you can't really, I don't think, wrap your head around it. But literally, you can step one foot this
Yeah.
way and be like, I am standing in a different world. Um, it's kind of
Yeah.
wild. But I love that we see that in this book, and that it sort of is a way to reflect, the nuances of the character too. There's light, there's dark, and there's sort of everything in between. And there is no black, no white. There's just a whole lot of gray. Um, but to
Yeah.
move away from the book and talk a little bit more broadly, I did want to ask if you would be willing to share a bit how your reading life has inspired your writing life. What books did you grow up on? How have they influenced you, and how are they still making their way into what you do creatively?
Sure. So I would say, you know, I really, really got into reading about 11. And when I say reading, I mean reading literature. So prior to that, you know, like a lot of kids my age, it was a lot of Hardy Boys and whatever we had in the school library. But I remember about 11 is when my father had a kind of modest library, but he was a social worker. He was an MSW, so he had tons of books on brain development, childhood development, psychology, sociology. But he also had a nice fiction section, and so he had Walter Mosley, and he had Eldridge Cleaver. He had the autobiography of Malcolm X, but he had Alice Walker. He had a lot of Harlem Renaissance. And so, and he also had some Michael Connolly. So, you know, I ended up pulling some books off the shelf one day, and it happened to be Devil in a Blue Dress. And I started reading it, and I was like, wow, like people write this? You know, prior to that, the experience that I had, you know, in terms of detective fiction was a children's book called Incognito Mosquito, in which it was a legit mosquito who was a detective, and he solved crimes, and, you know, it was like other bugs were doing crimes. And that was it, you know, and I remember, I loved that book because I was like, oh, this is so cool. But this was my first experience with a real detective. And so I remember I was reading it, and I was like, oh, my dad catching me reading this, I'm in trouble. So I would, you know, read a little bit and put it back. And then until I got to the end, and then I was like blown away. You know, and for me, I think you know, I got bit by the crime fiction bug, and moving from that was, you know, I started reading biographies. And so, you know, the second book was Soul on Ice. And so, you know, Eldridge Cleaver was a very interesting character,
Right.
to say the least. But it taught me and I still remember that book and the experience I had reading that book to this day. But it taught me character development, because I looked at him. Obviously, he was he was a human being. He was a real guy. You know, helped found the Black Panther Party. But for me, I was looking at it like, what an interesting character to go from, you know, being this predator, going to prison, and then coming out and leading a movement. And so I looked at it in that way of just a dynamic character and the progression. And I think that kind of shaped my writing early on, because I became very interested in characters who had done things in their past and had to kind of overcome those things and try their best to change who they were. And in some cases, my characters do change. In some cases, they just can't. They are who they are.
Sure. That's quite the pedigree, but I have to say, I've never heard of Incognito Mosquito. Mosquito Incognito. I have to look that up. I am fascinated by that. But that just shows you kind of the range, of fiction that is out there. And I wanted to ask you too, sometimes people talk down about genre fiction, mystery novels, suspense, but I think, that they are so immediate and so sort of resonant and relevant to what we're experiencing every day. And they also can be, fiction can be a really powerful lens through which to view reality, probably in a more palatable way than reading nonfiction. So I'm wondering if you have, thoughts about that and why it is that you're writing fiction versus nonfiction.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, the whole stigma of genre fiction, I mean, we've been dealing with that for a long time, right? That was one of the things that I won't say plagued Walter Mosley, but I think definitely annoyed him, because it was critics who were saying, well, he's writing crime fiction, he's writing detective fiction. But these were literary novels, and then it goes back to Dashiell Hammett as well, who felt the same way. But I think that there's something you can do in fiction that it just there's in some ways there's more possibility. You're not hindered by having to tell the truth. If I'm writing a biography and I'm working with someone who's trying to craft a memoir, well, you're beholden to the truth. You can fudge a little bit maybe, if you say it's creative nonfiction, but for the most part, you got to tell the truth or the lawsuits come flying, right? So, with fiction, it's a level of freedom, and I think it's one of those things where it becomes it can really be a powerful thing in the sense of you can craft these characters and you can put them to the gauntlet. You can give them so much conflict, more conflict than maybe a mere human outside of fiction could handle, right? That it's just, and some people in memoirs have those kind of lives, but in fiction, I can do that and I can do it poetically. And I kind of hold all the cards. And I think that there's power in that because there's something inherent about just old school storytelling. Sure, someone can tell you about their day or something that happened to them, but you don't engage with that story the same way as if someone says, I'm going to sit down and tell you this story about, this tragedy. Or I'm going to tell you this story about two characters who fall in love. It's a different experience. It's a different engagement level. Because if you tell me a story about you getting coffee that day, I'm kind of just waiting for you to get to the punchline. I'm like, okay, well, what happened? Was it scorched? What happened? But if you say, hey, I'm going to tell you this story, I actually settle in. I'm like, okay, tell me the story. I'm in it for the long haul. So I just think it's a different level of engagement.
If you want a punchline to a story about coffee, someday I will tell you about the time that I pulled up to my local Dunkin' Donuts where everybody knows me and my car died for good right there, like at the pickup window. And they still look at me. This was probably 8 years ago. And they still look at me with like sympathy, like he's the one who killed his car over a cup of coffee. How's that for a punchline?
Oh, no.
I've been a punchline my entire life.
I hope the coffee was good.
Yeah, right. It was a great cup of coffee. It was worth it. So just a couple more questions, if you don't mind, and then I will let you get back to writing and life. But I wanted to ask you, I'm always really fascinated by screenwriting because, in a lot of ways, it's really a unique beast. I mean, you obviously have to have an ear for dialogue, an eye for detail. But I'm wondering if you can talk about how you find that informs your novel writing, because even though, there are obviously differences, I would assume that there's a lot of carryover too in terms of structure and maybe how you visualize things. So can you do a quick compare and contrast between, screenwriting and writing a novel?
Sure. I mean, so if I'm my approach to writing a novel, I still outline. So, and that's something that I do for screenwriting as well. Now, screenwriting, if we're talking about in the traditional sense, you have a 3-act structure. Well, we don't say that within fiction, but it still exists. I mean, you got to have the beginning, middle, and end, and you're still looking for plot points and things that are going to have to happen to propel the story, and you're still looking at conflict. So those things don't really change. In terms of style, for me, I actually borrow a lot from screenwriting in the sense that if I'm writing action in a screenplay, I have to be very succinct. And I have to be clear and to the point. And I try and find ways to do that because in screenwriting, it's all about page count, right? Mm-hmm. So you want to keep it a certain page or people aren't going to read it. And that producer's going to say, this is 10 pages too long. I don't even want to bother with it. So it's all about economy. But it also goes back to one of my favorite, to paraphrase James Baldwin, one of my favorite kind of quotes of his, which is write a sentence as clean as a bone. And that applies for fiction and also applies for screenwriting, because that's kind of what, in terms of my writing practice, is what I'm after. I'm trying to get to the heart of, of the sentence. And oftentimes that means cutting a whole lot in revision, but it's not an easy thing to do. I mean, sometimes when I'm writing, I'll have a book of poetry there just to kind of make sure that my mind is in more of a succinct, operating in a succinct way, right? Poets do it very well. They can say so much in just a few sentences. And so, that's kind of the approach. And so there's a lot of similarities and there's a lot of differences. I would say with screenwriting, it does start visually. So I kind of visualize the scene. I do that in fiction, but I also pay more attention to the inner workings of the character. So in a scene with fiction, the characters, I kind of hear them more than if I'm writing a screenplay. Because with a screenplay, I'm kind of thinking, okay, I don't need to, the reader doesn't need to know everything. I can kind of pull back a little bit and a character can just do things without any explanation. Now you could do that within fiction. But for me, I look at character driven work and I'm attracted to that. So I like to kind of have some insight into why my characters do what they do without giving everything away, but at least a few lines that give a hint to why your character is operating the way your character is. But yeah, I would say that's kind of the biggest difference for me. But I think screenwriting can definitely inform crime fiction and noir writing for sure. It's quite a bit that I think that writers can learn from screenwriters if you're writing in those genres, because it's all about being succinct to the point and only using metaphors when you really have to.
You've studied writing formally, you've been a teacher of writing, and you do it. So my question to you is, in terms of a creative or a writing life, what is the best advice that you were ever given, and then the best advice that you were never given and had to learn for yourself through the process of actually doing it?
So the best advice I was given in terms of writing, I would say, write the story that you want to write. So, and that's very basic, right? But what the idea behind it is, if you go into a bookstore and you're looking for a particular story, but you just can't seem to find it, and in your gut, you're like, this is what I really, really want to read, that's what you should write. So write what you're so passionate about that you wish you could read, that's missing on the bookshelf. And so I kind of go in, when I write, I kind of think about that. I'm like, what would be an interesting story that you would just want to read? And I start there. What I'm currently working on right now is it's inspired by Patricia Highsmith's writing, but it's almost like Talented Mr. Ripley meets the hip hop community. Mm-hmm. And it's set in the world of hip hop, but it's centers on a sociopath, similar to Tom Ripley. And so, I just thought, as I'm working on the story, I was like, I would love to read that. And that's kind of how it started. I was like, I love Highsmith. I wish, and I also love hip hop. So I was like, I wish that there was a situation where, both of those things coexisted. And that's kind of what birthed, my work in progress. And so, that's kind of how I started. What I had to learn was more of the publishing side. So even though I got my MFA, not to knock on MFA programs, but sometimes they don't spend a whole lot of energy giving you the ins and outs of the business side. Mm-hmm. Within my program, and then hopefully it's changed by now, but within my program, we never actually learned how to write a query letter. We got tons of theory, we read tons of books, and talked about, so many elements of fiction and how to, have a strong foundation going into whatever you're working on. But when it came to the business side, I had to learn all that. I had someone tell me, I wrote my first novel was my thesis, The Science of Paul. And I was able to get that actually published before I submitted it to my thesis board. And years later, I had an agent tell me, I said, how come your first novel, you went with a small press? And I said, well, I tried to get an agent, tried to get a bigger press. And so, this agent told me, he said, well, what was in your query letter? And I said, I said, it's an existential noir. and the agent just stopped me immediately. Was like, that's why you didn't get an agent. And I was like, oh, okay, well, but it's like, you probably don't want to say existential. And so, readers hear that, and it's like agents automatically think like, oh, this is going to be a really small market for this book, and it's not worth their time. Even though what the agent was saying was like, you just wrote it. It's a crime novel. It's a mystery. You just pitch it clean. And I said, oh, okay, well, you live and you learn. But at that time, I thought, well, this is what it is. It's an existential, crime novel. Highly inspired by French existentialism, set in Philadelphia. But as my career progressed, I got better at it. And that's one thing I will tell budding authors or budding, folks who are writing and who really want to get published, is make sure people lay eyes on your query letter. Get it in front of as many people as you can and get feedback, and especially people who aren't in publishing. Get it in front of them so that they can kind of let you know, like, okay, you lost me here, because as authors, we get tunnel vision very easily and we think this makes perfect sense, and the query letter is important. It's what sells you and your book.
No, that's great advice and a point well taken. I can't tell you how many authors I've talked to, who've written the book and thought that was the end of the work, and then realized, oh my God, my job is just beginning. Like, I have a book, what do I do with it? So that's, excellent advice, and a little reality check there too. And, if you're going to take away something from this, don't put existentialism in your query letter.
Do not do it. I mean, there's certain buzzwords, out there that you want to hone in on, but existentialism is not one of them.
That's not the one. Oh man, but we can laugh about it now. That's terrific. All right, so final question for you. I'm wondering if you can leave us with a teaser as to what comes next, because Under Color of Law is out now. I believe that we're gonna get to revisit Trevor Finnegan again soon, and I'm assuming that's probably not the Highsmith hip hop hybrid. I'm assuming that might be a different.
No, it's not. Yeah, that's a different book. But yeah, there's a Trevor Finnegan sequel, which will be out this fall. And so within that book, it's set in 2016. So we have a little time there. 2 years have passed, but we find Trevor, he has a new mandate, and his new mandate is to work with the community to expose corrupt police officers. And on a stakeout, he witnesses one of these police officers that he's tailing or surveilling is executed in front of him. And it now throws him back into this world that he thought he was done with, especially when the partner of this executed officer is Trevor Finnegan's old partner. And so there is a lot of baggage that they have to unpack, but they realize that they need to work together if they're going to find this very brutal killer who's out targeting law enforcement.
Oh, well, that sounds ominous and wonderful. And, we've unpacked a lot of baggage here tonight. So let me thank you, Aaron Philip Clark. And anyone who's watching, I highly recommend you go pick up Under Color of Law. It's so good. Like I said, you're not going to do anything but read. So forget the laundry and the dishes and just enjoy the book. But thank you so much for being here. It's a real delight talking to you. And I am very much looking forward to the next book.
Thank you. This was great.
That's it for this episode of Central Booking. Thanks for watching, and be sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss a thing.